The United Nations has issued a plea to end the, quote, inhumane collective suffering in Gaza. The Secretary General described the situation in the Strip as a nightmare. Israel claims it's targeting Hamas, but at least 10,022 civilians have been killed since it began bombing the territory 4 weeks ago. Calls for a ceasefire have been dismissed by the Israeli government.
Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. Hundreds of girls and boys are reportedly being killed or injured every day. More journalists have reportedly been killed over a 4-week period than in any conflict in at least 3 decades. More United Nations aid workers have been killed than in any comparable period in the history of our organization. The way forward is clear. A humanitarian ceasefire now.
Well, medical supplies in Gaza can't cope with the constant flow of injured people. Many hospitals have run out of fuel and basic medical equipment. At least 32 of 35 medical facilities have stopped operating. Meanwhile, Israel continues to bomb Gaza. The violence has already displaced about 70% of the area's population in just 1 month. At least 1.6 million people have been left without a home. Al Jazeera's Hani Mahmoud is joining us from Khan Yunis inside the Gaza Strip, just bringing us up to date with the ongoing Israeli attacks that have been happening.
Yes, Rob. Well, within the past few hours and as of late hours of last night, Israeli airstrike continues to pound the Gaza Strip from north to south, literally every corner of this small territories. And as more airstrikes are being are targeting this area, more tragedies are created. In fact, in some areas, there are double tragedies are created. We're talking about more residential homes in the city of Rafah and Khan Yunis, where 20 people have been reported killed, and with more people under the rubble, the number is likely to increase in the coming hours. The problem with these targets of residential homes, these homes have evacuees who came all the way from Gaza City and the northern part, where they were told and ordered by the Israeli military that these are safe areas for you to go to, but they found themselves under heavy fire power of those airstrikes. Those who survived these airstrikes becomes displaced for the second time, and this is the tragedy. Double displacement of those evacuees. In Gaza City alone, last night, heavy bombardments and more fire belts are created, isolating entire neighborhoods and entire residential blocks, destroying vast majority of the infrastructure and the roads. The use of these new insidious warfare instruments to destroy all those remaining buildings in Gaza Center, particularly in what seems to be an attempt by the Israeli military to clear the way for its army and tanks to push further into the center of Gaza. The surrounding area of a Shifa hospital has been a major site of heavy bombardment, not only destroying and targeting civilians in there, but also destroying any elements of life that could keep people going on. We're talking about solar panel and power generators that were functioning in the past few days have been targeted by the Israeli airstrikes. Airstrikes do not stop. They are around the clock, creating more tragedies, destroying as much as they can, and creating a sheer amount of damage in what seems to be inflicting pain and damage on the population who decided to stay in Gaza and the northern part.
Hani, you've been telling us over the last few weeks about how people are struggling to get hold of food and fuel and humanitarian aid, the little aid that is getting in. But it seems from what we've been seeing, certainly over the last couple of days, that the crisis is particularly centered on the hospitals and the medical facilities.
Yes, Rabul, that is exactly what's happening. Hospitals have the largest share of this humanitarian crisis as they deal on daily basis, not only daily, but on hourly basis. There is a tsunami of casualties coming into hospitals where doctors are under heavy pressure. Hospitals are overwhelmed to respond to the needs of those injuries coming to the hospital, but without medical supplies, enough medical supply, without a fuel supply, these hospitals are not functioning, not even to the low capacity right now. We have an example of how a Shifa hospital is running on subordinate small power generators just to keep ventilation, ICU working. But as of the coming hours, as we heard in a statement by the hospital official, they are not going to be able to continue offering this service. The similar scenario applies to the Indonesian hospital. What seems to be this is too much pressure on not only hospital but the residents who are stranded in Gaza and the northern part, in a direct message telling them there is no life here, there's nothing that will keep you continuing. You need to head south, only to more bombardment, unfortunately.
Hani Mahmoud talking to us from Khan Yunis in Gaza Strip. Hani, thank you. Well, the White House says President Joe Biden has spoken to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the phone, and Netanyahu has again reiterated that Israel will not initiate a ceasefire. We're covering this on both sides of the Atlantic. Rob Reynolds is in Washington, D.C. We're going to start by talking to Sarah Khairat, who's in occupied East Jerusalem. What more do we know about this latest conversation, Sarah?
Yeah, well, one thing that the US has been pushing for, and certainly US President Joe Biden, is to see these temporary ceasefires, or what they call tactical pauses. Israel has maintained a stance that a full ceasefire will not happen. They won't even entertain the idea. But they said that he, in this conversation, did say that potentially there could be a tactical pause, an hour here or there, in an interview that he had with ABC News, but just saying that the only way that would happen is if the hostages are fully released, and giving that time that it would need to release those hostages, that would be the pause in fighting or in any airstrikes. They also discussed the importance of humanitarian aid coming in. The US is trying to push Israel to allow more trucks in. They said that they're looking now over the next coming weeks to expand the checks, the security checks that Israel does of these trucks that move in, as it accuses Hamas of diverting some of that aid to its fighters. Of course, Hamas has denied this. Just to give you an idea, in terms of humanitarian aid, over the last 24 hours, only 30 trucks went in. Before this war, you had about 500 trucks going in every single day.
Sarah, I know that Benjamin Netanyahu has also been doing an interview with ABC News, the American channel, about his plans for Gaza in the long term. What's he been saying about that?
Yeah, incredible, really, because he was asked very direct questions. Until now, there had been Israeli sources that had kind of implied that once this war is over, they would take over the security. But this is the first time we're actually hearing it from the Prime Minister himself. Let's take a listen.
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas, it certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
Now, Israel before this had said that it's not interested in, once this war is over, all it's interested in is getting rid of Hamas and that network of tunnels to completely cripple it, that Hamas would no longer govern Gaza. It had said that it had no interest in controlling Gaza. Well, an indefinite period, it's still not clear what that means or what the details are as to their plan moving forward. There has been talk, of course, from the US that potentially the Palestinian Authority authority that governs occupied West Bank could also govern Gaza? These are all big questions. It seems that will clearly come up again now that he has said this, because that is a real concern and a real worry for Palestinians, where they don't want Israel to take control of the Gaza Strip.
Sarah, thanks a lot. That's Sarah Kairat in occupied East Jerusalem. We're going to bring in Rob Reynolds. He's in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. angle on this. Joe Biden has made it fairly plain right from the get-go that he is not keen on Israel taking control of the Gaza Strip, that he doesn't think that that would be a suitable thing to do. Now we've had this comment from Benjamin Netanyahu. Are we starting to see some cracks here in the unity that both sides have been trying to show since this conflict began?
I think you've seen some cracks, some divergence between the two countries already for some time now, especially over the issue of civilian casualties. And the United States and President Biden himself, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and other officials urging the Israelis to prevent civilian casualties in Gaza, requests and persuasion that the Israelis so far appear to have ignored. As far as the security responsibility that the Prime Minister talked about, President Biden last month described any kind of idea of a full-scale occupation of Gaza as, in his words, a big mistake. And he pointed to the U.S. military's experience in Afghanistan and Iraq as examples of what Israel could be getting into.
We were seeing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken doing the diplomatic rounds of Arab leaders over the last few days. The public impression is that he came back pretty much empty-handed, that both sides on each case basically stated where they stood on the issue of what the conflict, but there wasn't really much common ground. Just talk us through what the impression actually is of whether or not Blinken did actually manage to achieve anything.
Well, certainly in respect to his talks with the Israeli government, where Blinken also urged humanitarian pauses in the bombing and bombardment of Gaza, he was rebuffed on that. But in talking with other regimes, other governments in the region, other leaders, his primary mission was to shore up support from those governments in the region against any notion that Iran may have of using Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen to widen the conflict. And to the extent that that has not happened, that could be considered a success.
Rob, thanks very much indeed. Rob Reynolds talking to us from Washington, D.C. Still ahead on Al Jazeera, Palestinians in the West Bank said they're being targeted even more than before as Israeli forces intensify their bombing campaign in Gaza.
As the war on Gaza continues, we bring you the latest reactions and global outcry.
In our silence, they experience violence.
As a Jewish person, Israel does not represent me.
The killing of all those innocent families in Israel was terrible, but the response is even worse.
It's a genocide.
It is not acceptable to have hostages, and it is even more unacceptable to have children hostages.
Palestinians are counting on each and every one of us.
It's not about religion, it's about humanity coming together and fighting for what's right.
You're watching Al Jazeera. Reminder of our top stories this hour. Israeli forces have carried out airstrikes overnight on southern Gaza. More than 10,000 Palestinians have been killed since Israel began its bombing campaign on October the 7th. Medical centers in Gaza are struggling to cope with the constant flow of injured people. Most hospitals have run out of basic medical supplies and fuel. At least 32 out of 35 medical facilities have stopped operating. The war on Gaza has forced about 70% of the territory's people from their homes in 1 month. Gaza's media office says at least 1.6 million are now homeless. We're going to bring in Noor Ode. She's a political analyst and writer. She's joining us live from Ramallah. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. I want to talk to you about the differences, shall we say, in opinion that we're beginning to see emerge between the US and the Biden administration and Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, particularly over this latest statement by Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Israel would be responsible for Gaza, quote, indefinitely after the conflict comes to an end. What do you make of the difference in phrasing, let me put it like that we're hearing both from the US and from Israel?
Well, Netanyahu has the Biden administration in a pickle, if you will. On the one hand, this administration has gone above and beyond to express support for Israel, to provide it with military assistance, to engage actively in the military thinking and strategizing, and to give assurances to the international community that this is not about annexation, that this is not about forcible displacement of the population in Gaza. But because Netanyahu knows that the administration can't really walk back all of that support, he's basically taking full advantage. So selling whatever he can to his own base, trying to protect or extend whatever time he can spend still in the government before investigations and accountability would happen at his end. This will be very embarrassing for Washington, domestically and internationally. They have the leverage. They can influence where Israel is taking Gaza and the region, but I'm not sure that they're in a position to do that at the moment because they've positioned themselves in such a way that they're basically in lockstep with the current Israeli government, with Netanyahu. In many ways, Biden has tied his fate to this man.
The US already hands out $3.8 billion a year in military assistance to Israel. That's under a 10-year plan that's been running since, I think, about 2016. Is it a surprise that the US doesn't have greater influence over Israel, given the fact that it's providing so much military assistance?
I think the lack of influence comes from the fact that there isn't anyone within the decision-making circles in Washington who's willing to use the leverage that they have. And people in Tel Aviv know that. And so all of that money, all of that support, all of that American leverage becomes moot because nobody's willing to use it. Nobody's willing to tell Israel, in exchange for that support, you need to listen, you need to not embarrass us, you need to not take steps that would be indefensible in front of the world. That's not happening. And I think many observers in Washington have, penned articles in the past few days saying that we shouldn't expect it to happen. That's just not in the political DNA of this administration.
We've been reporting that about 70% of people in Gaza have been essentially made homeless. They've certainly been displaced from their homes. I want to bring you back to this point about that Netanyahu has made about Israel being in charge, possibly, of Gaza's security at some point in the future. What do you think is going to happen to Palestinians in Gaza should that happen?
Well, I covered the Israeli re-invasion and reoccupation of the West Bank in 2002. And what Israel did then is that it systematically and methodically went into Palestinian cities, destroyed a lot of the civilian infrastructure, destroyed all the governance infrastructure, detained thousands of people. And then after that, it was willing to entertain some efforts, international efforts of reconstruction and assistance for governance in accordance with Israeli diktats. I think that's what probably Netanyahu has in mind at the moment, but that would require even more violence, an extended period of a ground invasion going through all of these cities that your reporters are reporting on from the ground in Gaza. So it's not just Beit Hanun at the edges of at the edges of the Gaza Strip to the north. We're talking about Jabalia. We're talking about Gaza City. We're talking about all of those densely populated areas, going through them, disarming Palestinian groups, completely, finalizing the complete decimation and destruction of infrastructure in Gaza, and then handing it over, right, to somebody else who will pick up the tab financially, pick up the tab politically, reconstruct the Gaza Strip, but knowing that the security overlord, that those who call the shots will be the Israelis who can come in at any moment. That will translate into more brutality. In the short term,